And it's often said that Americans don't pay enough attention to international news. I certainly think that's true. I don't know how you feel, but that's certainly my take on things. And yet there's so much going on internationally, especially right now at this moment in Europe, worthy of our attention beside the Notre Dame fire, which is, sure, it's a big deal. It's an enormous work of historical and cultural significance. The damage to it is tragic and traumatic for a lot of us. But there's a lot more to be discussing. And I thought to catch us up on several issues having to do with France and the European community in general. It'd be a great time to talk to our friend Cole Stangler. Cole is a great writer. He writes for a number of publications, The Nation, Jacobin, Vice, etc. He's based in Paris. He's there now. He's written a couple of recent pieces of interest. So without any further ado, Cole Stangler, thanks for coming back on the Zero Hour.
Thanks so much for having me, RJ. Always a pleasure.
Same here. Now, let's start with Notre Dame. One of the things you mentioned in a note, I think, was and something that I'd been thinking about a lot was the relationship between Notre Dame and the reaction to the fire there and the sort of neoliberal world order. Now, I have some thoughts about that. As I said in the beginning, of course it's tragic. Of course it's terrible to have works of art or beautiful things damaged or destroyed. But let's start with, you're there. It must have been traumatic for the whole city. But what are your thoughts on the fire at Notre Dame?
Yeah, it was obviously a horrible, horrible thing to see. It's something you just don't ever think you're going to see ever. This cathedral had been there since the 12th century. So it turns out actually that as people have seen, the fire turned out to be not as bad as, or at least not as destructive as people had feared, because of the firefighters that went in and were able to ultimately save the structure of the cathedral. And now it's going to be rebuilt. Emmanuel Macron says that he's promised it will be rebuilt in 5 years, which seems very ambitious. But hey, if he thinks that it's possible, great. I think it's also that 5-year timeline is also, deeply reflective of also the Olympics coming to Paris. And I think that the government wants to have the cathedral in place for the Olympics in 2024. So I think that explains the timeline there. But what we saw also in the aftermath of the fires, the very next day, we saw the government call for donations, and we saw some of France's richest families putting in money for the reparation, for repairing of Notre Dame. We've now seen, I think, we're out over 800 million euros has been promised or given by these extremely wealthy families and sources. So that in particular, the Arnault family, which owns the LMVH luxury brand line, as well as the Pinot family, which owns another luxury, basically holding house, Kering, which owns a bunch of luxury brands. I think Gucci is one of them. We've seen these two families now donating lots of money, and we saw a call as well. Initially, after the families promised the money following the fire, we saw a call from the former culture minister, who's a financial advisor to one of the families, saying, this would be great if the donations that they're giving, if these donations would be tax exempt. I think that sparked a lot of outrage. And to me, actually, on a sentimental note, I actually found that kind of refreshing. That the day after this traumatic, horrible fire to this institution, that's not just a Catholic institution, but really a symbol of Paris and an architectural marvel for the world. But after this traumatic fire, people were already getting upset at the super rich in France for trying to use this as a vehicle for decreasing their tax bill. So there's been a lot of pushback against that, and even setting aside the question of whether the donations are tax exempt or not. And now it seems like because of the pushback, they're not going to be tax exempt, or at least some of the donations they've now announced they're just giving the money directly. That's good, but I think even setting aside that question of the taxes, people are wondering, why is it that the LMVH company, the Arnault family, they can't give pennies to they're closing factories left and right. They can't give pennies to their workers. When the money, they have lots of money, but it takes Notre Dame to burn for them to actually give some of it up. And I think one of the best reactions I saw was, people responding to this apparent wave of generosity from the richest families in France, saying, they're responding to the Victor Hugo novel Notre Dame. It'd be awesome if they could give the same response to the victims of his other novel Les Miserables, which is obviously referring to the working class and the poor of Paris. So we don't see the same generosity there, obviously.
Yeah, it's fascinating from a kind of cultural as well as political aspect. First of all, I mean, I'm rusty on the exchange rate, but we're talking about roughly $1 billion, right? In U.S. dollars, that all of a sudden it's just like that, it's available. Meanwhile, you go to some of the banlieues just outside Paris. Poverty rate is 42% in one of them that I was reading about the other day. So you have this enormous disparity of rich and poor, which itself harkens back to the 12th and 13th centuries, I would say. And you have this sense that people are so willing to give to something that kind of and I don't mean in any way to denigrate the beauty of Notre Dame, which I saw just last year again, but something that reflects the kind of opulent beauty rather than this kind of simple beauty of people going about their daily lives, or the beauty of multicultural expression, or beauty of art being made, or whatever it might be, that there's immediate willingness to open their checkbooks for only the most grand form of beauty. Seems to me to be a kind of vanity too, if you get what I'm driving at.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think Notre Dame is the symbol of France, and they obviously want to associate themselves with the grandeur of French patrimony, as the people use the word a lot here, the kind of French cultural heritage. The rich want themselves to be associated with that, and yet at the same time, they're more than willing to outsource their textile production to Eastern Europe when the time calls for it, and that's what LMVH has done. LMVH, of the Arnault family, they'll with great pleasure move their factories to Eastern Europe and pay a fraction of the wages that they would have to pay in France, which already aren't even that high. So, absolutely.
And I am very heartened that there is a vigorous debate about it, and that, as you say, that it happened, very quickly after this traumatic event. It's good. It's healthy. It's right. And one of the things that strikes me is I visited Paris a couple times in the last couple of years, but I haven't been there since the Yellow Vest movement came, and my understanding is, I don't know exactly where that stands right now, but my understanding is that a lot of neighborhoods in Paris look different, particularly the wealthier ones and the shopping ones, and that the climate overall in the country has changed a lot as a result of many weeks of Gilets Jaunes activity. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to exaggerate it too much. I think when we hear, when you see these images of these spectacular images of destruction in Paris, and and rioting and things on fire, it's really limited to a handful of neighborhoods, which happen to be the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. And there's a reason why the protests have been concentrated in those neighborhoods. But I think if you own a restaurant like Fouquet's, which is this very glitzy restaurant on the Champs-Élysées that Nicolas Sarkozy had his post-presidential victory dinner at, very famously, that caters to a super wealthy clientele that's staying in the 8th arrondissement, the 8th district of Paris, at these hotels near the Champs-Élysées. If you own that restaurant, you're probably scared of the protests. Like, I think if you own, the banks in the same areas as well, I think, people are a little bit frightened. But other than that, these protests have been pretty nonviolent overall. And it's really, a handful of people in Paris who are afraid for their businesses. And frankly, I think they deserve to be, really. So, I think otherwise the rest of the country, these protests have been pretty nonviolent and don't really pose a threat. It's a handful of neighborhoods in Paris.
Yeah. So the little African restaurant that my wife and I went to on a little alleyway is probably okay, right? Probably not targeted. So is it still going on in a substantial way? Are the demonstrations still going on over the weekends?
It's still happening, which is kind of remarkable. I think we're now coming up on this Saturday will be Act 23, if I'm not mistaken. So going back to November 17th, 2018. This is now the 23rd straight weekend, 23rd straight Saturday what the Yellow Vests are protesting. And it's still going on. I think it's lost some momentum clearly. If you look at just the numbers, people have a tendency to be very skeptical of the official government figures, which come from the Interior Ministry, and they're right to be skeptical of those figures. At the same time, I think even if you account for some minimization that's coming from the government, it's pretty clear that these protests have been waning now, which makes sense, after weekend after weekend after weekend. So then the movement has also lost some popularity. At the beginning, we had about 70, 80% support in the polls. It's now down to just a little bit over 50%. But I think that the big wild card here as well is what's also happening right now in France. And actually, Macron was going to make a speech about the very topic just an hour before the fire broke out of Notre Dame, and he then postponed this speech. But Macron was planning to announce the results of the so-called Great Debate, the Great National Debate, which is one of his responses to the Yellow Vest movement, which was to say, okay, people are angry. We're going to launch a national debate. We're going to have events across the country where you'll be able to come and express your grievances. You can do it online as well. And then at the end of this process, which is going to take place over several weeks, we'll get together and we'll look through all the grievances that have been expressed. And we're going to present a number of reforms that ostensibly are going to respond to these grievances. And so the speech that Macron was slated to give before the fire broke out was going to be the government's official response to the Great Debate, and by extension, really the kind of final response. At least that's how they see it, to the Yellow Vest protest movement. And so I think what'll be interesting to see is the government's response when it comes out, and they're not going to be able to keep. They won't be able to. This period of national unity and mourning of Notre Dame is only going to last so long. I think by next week it'll. I think things will be back to normal. I think there's a possibility for the movement to either get some more momentum or to have some more convergence of people frustrated at the government when they make public their reforms, and I think they're bound to disappoint.
So yeah, I'm fascinated by that whole process. I knew about the Great Debate, and it struck me, as it struck many people, that first you had Emmanuel Macron elected, very much in my mind the reflection of the sort of neoliberal established financial elite and establishment, very much reflecting that culturally and politically and stylistically. You had the Yellow Vest movement, a huge reaction against that. I had the sense that Macron responded at first with what seems to be his characteristic lordly disdain, and then decided he better, have something more systematic. Had this Great Debate, which candidly to me reminded me of when centrist Democrats have a listening tour or whatever. But maybe I'm being unfair. I don't know. And then he was going to respond to the summary of these national conversations, and. So, okay, that was put off by this, but I can't believe that his response will, whatever it is going to completely blunt. It would take a huge reversal, I would think, of policy and position for him to have any kind of response that would blunt certainly the dissatisfaction behind the protests. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, I agree with that assessment. One of the big cries of the Yellow Vest protests, and it depends really on where you are in the country, but I think still overall, I think it's fair to say one of the big demands has been for fiscal justice, so tax justice. This idea, why should the poor be having to spend more money, hundreds of euros more per month to pay for fuel taxes, while you're giving the rich, the super rich, a massive tax cut, as Macron has done at his very first budget as president repealing the wealth tax in France, which had previously applied to people with over 1.3 million euros in assets. So Macron repealed that his very first budget. So you had this cry for tax justice, for fiscal justice, and according to press reports of what we've seen of Macron's speech that he was going to give, the government is planning to decrease taxes. We don't really know what that means, but at least decrease taxes for working class and for middle class people in some fashion, whether that's by eliminating or drawing back one of the different tranches of the tax rates. In any case, a lowering of taxes. And it's true that has been part of the movement from Neoliberalism, is saying, we're being taxed too much. But another critical piece of it, and I would argue maybe even more important, is saying it's not just about lowering taxes for the working class. It's about saying the rich need to pay their fair share. So you can't address this question of tax justice by only saying we're going to lower taxes just a little bit for working and middle class people by however much they're going to. You have to also complement it by saying the rich need to pay their fair share, and more specifically, Macron needs to reestablish the wealth tax that he repealed. That's been one of the most central demands of the movement. Again, very closely tied to the question of tax justice, saying the government should reinstitute the wealth tax that they repealed in their very first budget. And there's been no signs that the government's going to do that. So I think you'll have this. That is the central demand, and the government has decided for political reasons or otherwise that this is not something that they're prepared to do. And I think people are going to continue to be upset about that.
Well, you wrote a piece, and again, we're talking with a journalist, Paris-based journalist called Stangler. You wrote a piece that was published the other day, or last week actually, in The Nation, President of the Rich, about Macron, first talking about this now infamous confrontation Macron had with a 25-year-old unemployed worker, where he showed sort of incredible insensitivity to the plight of any unemployed person. But then talking about his tax cuts for the ultra-rich, and I'm quoting you, a decrease in low-income housing aid and labor reforms, quote-unquote, that make it easier to lay off workers, and then go on to say these Macronisms have fueled the former investment banker's image as president of the rich. So he's going into that with that image. I don't know, predictions, or is it pointless to predict? We just need to wait and see what he says.
Yeah, we'll have to see what they say. I think one of the responses has also been supposedly to abolish this very famous school in France, the ENA, the National Administration School, which really is kind of a finishing school for the country's political elites. You kind of have to go to ENA to be either a high functionary, a high civil servant, or to have a great political career. A number of presidents have graduated from ENA, including Macron himself. So in any case, one of the responses from the government supposedly is going to be to abolish the school, the ENA. And it's a very kind of lackluster, symbolic measure to say, oh, you French people, you're upset about the elites. Okay, we'll get rid of the school they all go to, which, seems to me to be pretty superficial. And I think taking people for, underestimating people's intelligence, frankly. So that's not going to make the anger go away. I think one of the other big complaints that we've seen from the Yellow Vest movement, at least one of the issues that it's raised, has been the lack of public investment, or the disinvestment, or at least the freezing of public investment in these rural areas and the peripheral areas of France. So these areas that are either farmlands, rural, or also on the outer bands of suburbs, parts of the country that depend heavily on public services, because there's less jobs, either unemployment is high, or there's just less work available in general. And these parts of the country rely heavily on the state for public transport, for hospitals, for education. And if you really wanted to take the movement seriously and take the anger seriously, you need to grapple with these sorts of questions, to start investing more in public services, to re-implement that wealth tax that we were just talking about. These are the kinds of questions that the protests have underlined, and doesn't seem to be the route of Emmanuel Macron.
And these seem antithetical to the Macron philosophy of shrinking the public sector and so on. So one of the, and what this leads into, and it's something else you've written about recently, but it leads into, you had what I thought Cole Stangler was a very, as usual, very well written and surprisingly genteel piece of why criticizing the EU isn't always wrong for a Commonweal magazine. And the reason why I say genteel is because, you know, I feel strongly that criticizing the EU isn't always wrong. It doesn't mean I would be a left leave voter if I lived in Great Britain, although I might, you know, I don't know. But it seems to me the reason why I make the segue from Macron to the EU is probably obvious to you, but there is a certain financial status quo and a certain mindset of financial and policy elites that includes most of the political elites in the United States, or at least historically up till Trump, and now I would argue the Trump administration as well, and certainly the EU, that the Macronism reflects. First of all, is that a fair statement?
I think absolutely, yeah.
And then one of the things that strikes me, for example, is I talk from time to time to a reporter for Libération, another French magazine, a newspaper that interviews me from time to time, and the reporter there was saying that with the EU, the European Community elections coming up, that there are no left candidates to speak of. This was several months ago. There didn't seem to be a left slate of candidates with any power or influence, that it really seemed like these upcoming elections were likely in France to become a matchup between the center, so-called, as embodied by Macron, and the far right is embodied by Marine Le Pen. So first of all, you think that's true? Is that still true, or was it true?
There's lots of left-wing parties, and that might be the problem, is that we now have about six or seven so-called or ostensibly left-wing parties that are presenting lists for the elections. And you know, there's a nice game you can play. If you add up the cumulative votes that each of them get, you start to realize actually this could be a majority that has more support, or at least equal to, if not more support, than both Macron and the newly renamed National Rally Party. They're no longer the National Front, the far right party of Marine Le Pen. So today in France, there's a number of left-wing parties that are running. Each one is getting under 10% of the vote. You have to name a handful, then you have the France Insoumise. So I think they like to be called France Unbowed. I'm not sure if that's the best translation, but that's what they say. So France Insoumise, the group of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, has about 9%, just under 10% in the polls. You have the Greens that are getting about 8% in the polls. You have the Communist Party, which is getting about 3% in the polls. You have the Socialist Party, the kind of zombified Socialist Party, right, which is made with another party called Public Square, loosely, and they're getting about 4%. And you also have Benoît Hamon's party called Génération, which is aligned to Yanis Varoufakis's alliance in Europe, and they're getting about 3% or so. So there are left-wing parties, to say nothing of the Trotskyist party, the Workers' Struggle, which has about 1% in the polls. So those are a lot of parties, and if you add them up, it comes to represent something significant. But the problem is the left in France likes to be divided, and that's a whole other conversation about why there's all these different factions. And I was able to kind of follow France Insoumise on the campaign trail a little bit to kind of see what their strategy was. But at the moment, it's true. You have all these parties kind of representing, each with under 10% of the vote, and then leaving the real debate in France, unfortunately, that the main cleavage, sadly, is basically between this Emmanuel Macron kind of light neoliberalism versus Marine Le Pen, who has this far right populism that, ironically, sadly ends up actually defending France's safety net, at least rhetorically, more than Macron. So it's a really really rotten kind of debate that's in France today, and it's sad.
Well, if I look back at the results of the first round of the last election, and I mean, I don't have it memorized, but as I recall, obviously it wound up being Macron versus Le Pen in the second round. but the total number of left votes, if you include the Socialist Party, which ran somebody seemed better than Hollande at least, the Socialist Party, Mélenchon, and whoever else was in there now. I think at the time I added up the socialist vote, and it was more than the centrist vote, but because of the splitting even then, Macron got the chance to run. So is Mélenchon just another face in the crowd now? I mean, they were talking about him at one point during the first round of balloting as the French Bernie Sanders, although he seemed to me to be pretty different from Bernie. But is he just another face in the crowd?
You know, Mélenchon and France Insoumise had a lot of momentum coming out of the 2017 presidential race. They lost some of it just weeks later with the legislative elections, which were marked by historic levels of abstention, so really low turnout in France. I think around 25% turnout, which is very, very low in France. So people were basically tired from the presidential election and kind of upset that Emmanuel Macron had won, and we had very low levels of turnout. And of course, you know, some people do support Macron. I don't want to. We have to acknowledge that as well. So it's not majority. It's not a majority of the population, but there is a base that exists, and they turn out to the polls. In any case, since the 2017 election, France Insoumise has been having internal problems. There's a lack of democracy in the movement. At least accusations. Accusations. There's a lack of democracy. We've seen Mélenchon also on a personal level kind of be grating on people. There's the infamous now affair of the police raids that happened last fall, so fall 2018, where just before the election, I think it was in October 2018, you had police raids on the main offices of France Insoumise investigating alleged violations alleged violations of campaign finance law. And the response of La France Insoumise to this, and it should be said also, police raids in France are actually fairly common as just a judicial maneuver of how prosecutors obtain information. And France Insoumise was more than happy to applaud police raids when they were done on Sarkozy and their political opponents. In any case, Mélenchon's response to these police raids was to say this was a attack on the opposition, and this was politically motivated 100%, and that this was unacceptable. And he had a very famous encounter with the officers of the court marshals in the office, where Mélenchon he's either blocking the door or trying to get in, and he literally says, in arguing with this court marshal, and his face is fuming, he's all red, and he says, I am the Republic. Kind of harkening back to the Louis XIV, and the I am the state sort of thing.
Right.
So, officially, what he's trying to say is he's a parliamentarian. He needs to be treated with respect. The parliamentarians represent the Republic. It doesn't really matter because more or less he made a fool of himself, and I think that really turned people off of La France Insoumise. So that was also an unfortunate episode for the party, and they've really struggled since since then. And I think also what we're seeing right now with the success of the Greens, I think the success of the Greens is less about them as a political party. They're kind of an empty shell. They don't have any representatives in parliament. But the Greens represent to some people this kind of softer version of the left that isn't as scary as Mélenchon, isn't as authoritarian seeming as Mélenchon, with their problems of democracy and his kind of personal bravado. So the Greens represent a kind of safer bet than the other important point also is the European Union. The Greens seem to be less Eurosceptic, which is a word that I don't like using because it's big, but I think a lot of people that voted for Mélenchon in 2017 see the Greens as a more pro-European option. If you're going to vote in the European elections, you tend to be someone who believes in the European Union, unless you're going to be a full-on protest vote for the far right. The kind of electorate that turns out these European elections tends to believe in the European Union, and that's not good for a party like La France Insoumise or for left-wing parties that have this, very ambivalent, complicated relationship to the European Union.
Yeah, and it's a shame. It's a shame because that leaves, in terms of national politics, a choice between nationalism and internationalism that, isn't likely to play out well. And it would be nice to see the European Union redirect itself, become a more worker-friendly, environment-friendly, progressive institution, yeah, rather than see it surrendered to the people who will, leave it an instrument of the elites. But I guess in closing, Cole Stangler, any global thoughts on what's going on in France? I mean, obviously the Yellow Vest movement was unexpected and has had a huge impact. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, just waiting to see?
Yeah, I think everyone who's tried to make predictions about the Yellow Vest has been wrong. It's kind of remarkable that this is still continuing. We're now 23 weeks later and the movement is still going. I think it underlines real frustration with the president. Afterwards, after that, it's hard to say what's going to happen. I shouldn't predict, but I think with these European elections coming up, and it's the kind of argument that I tried to outline in the Commonweal piece that we were just talking about is the European Union is in a lot of ways is a real obstacle to left-wing projects, left-wing political projects, whether they're in France or in Spain or in Eastern Europe or wherever. And I think that's something that the European left is really grappling with, and it's something that you can either pretend doesn't exist. That if a left-wing government gets elected, you're not going to have to deal with the European Commission and the various institutions and the kind of discipline they want to impose, or you're going to have to figure out a way to confront it. And the kind of unfortunate thing about these European elections that are coming up in May here, the 23rd to the 26th, is that we're not going to resolve this dilemma, right away. Even if more, social justice-oriented parties are able to win seats in the European Parliament itself doesn't have that much power. It has very little power. It can't even propose its own legislation. Reforming the treaties requires support of all the member states. In any case, it's I don't mean to end on such a pessimistic note, but when you think about the prospects of the left going forward here, the European elections are, gonna I think produce a not so positive result, however way you look at it. But I think to come back to the French situation, it's clear there's a lot of opposition to Emmanuel Macron and from all parts of the population, from civil servants, from students, from retirees, from unemployed people, and hopefully we'll see. There's a lot that's uncertain, but hopefully we can see that move in a more progressive and left-wing direction. There's a lot to play for and a lot of uncertainty, and that makes things both frightening but also exciting.
And interesting. So, all right, we'll have to leave it there. But Cole Stangler, Paris-based journalist, writes for The Nation, Vice, elsewhere, Jacobin. As always, thanks for the great reporting. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.